What's up, Wizards? It's Dev, aka The Walking Bread. Got my boy Ziggy with me. We're from Mtg. Magic cards. And you know what? I know that Halloween was like almost 3 weeks ago at this point. It just felt like it came and went. We didn't pay enough attention to it, which made me sad because Halloween is like my favorite holiday by a lot. So I'm not ready to give it up yet. I want to do one more spoopy deck tech. And there's plenty of spooky subject matter to choose from in Standard right now, too. In fact, creepy creature types have a rich and storied tradition in the game, from horrors and nightmares to beasts and insects, but easily the king of the creepy creature type is zombies. Since day one, son. Sorry, vampire players. Hope you're not feeling too sorin about that. I am very clever. As a matter of fact, zombies is one of the few creature types that's had payoffs since the beginning of the game, all the way back to Zombie Master. Remember this guy? A lot of people were introduced to the concept of a tribal deck in the first place because of this guy. And since '93, people have been trying to make zombies work in every format. Sometimes they do. Often they don't, but right now in Standard, we actually have the ability to make a pretty decent zombie deck that can hang with the big boys at a relatively cheap price. This thing comes in well south of $100, and that's not a bad price for a deck that can do a lot of really fun stuff, in large part thanks to a card that in some ways reminds me of Zombie Master, and that's Liliana's Devotee. Probably the only payoff for playing zombies in Standard, but if we got a payoff for playing zombies, your boy's gonna play zombies. First of all, this ability is really good for keeping your board state up, even in the face of spot removal and whatnot. This makes instant speed spot removal from your opponent just kind of an embarrassing proposition on their end. They lose a card, but you kind of don't, so they can keep doing that as much as they want. Your board state's still going to look pretty healthy. And finally, maybe the most important thing this does is allow you to swing a little bit more liberally with the rest of your zombie team. You're not going to be sending in Devotee unless the coast is clear, because you really don't want this to die in combat, but you can swing with your other dudes en masse, knowing that you're going to be able to replace at least one of them at the end of the turn. Like, note in this gameplay clip, for example, against Felidar Retreat deck, that's right, there are gameplay clips again, you're welcome. We're able to swing in super liberally here and not care that our creatures die, because we know theirs are going to die, and we're going to be able to replace ours. Note the difference in board state between what we swing into and what we're left with. But if you're going to build a deck around Devotee, it means you got to play some zombie boys. And it turns out we actually have better zombies than I thought we did in Standard when I initially put together this deck idea. We got really good stuff like Foulmire Knight, as well as Mire Trident and Timorous Calls the Dead. All of these are solid cards. Foulmire Knight, not too bad, can draw you cards sometimes. It can hold off big dudes like Lovestruck Beast, Bone Crusher Giant, on and on and on, to allow you a little bit more time to develop that board state. Foulmire Knight's a very important card, and it's a great one-drop. As far as Mire Trident goes, we are doing some graveyard shenanigans, very on brand for zombies, I suppose, but this is good for filling up the graveyard and gaining a little bit of life to, again, keep us in the game against those aggro decks. And just like Foulmire, it's got that death touch so it can block big dudes when it has to. As far as Timorous Calls, this is one of the better cards in the deck, even though obviously Timoret's a bit of a boomer, right? I would prefer to text the dead. Who calls anymore? But still, you can't argue with success. This thing eventually gets us 4 total power, and if we have a Devotee out, it gets us 6 total power, plus scries, plus even more life gained to make sure that we can, buy some time against these aggro decks to develop our board. All of these are very, very important cards and really bread and butter for the deck. But as far as Timorous Calls the Dead goes, be very careful what you take out of your graveyard with it, because again, we've got more graveyard shenanigans than just Timorous in this deck. Now, it should come as no surprise that I'm also playing the full set of Murderous Rider. I mean, it's a good enough card on its own, and that's true of a lot of the zombies in this deck. They're solid cards by themselves that you kind of want to play anyway, but in a zombie deck, they become way better, and Murderous Rider is kind of the epitome of that, because you want to play Hero's Downfall anyway, even if it does do 2 damage to you. It doesn't really matter. We've got enough incidental life gain between the lifelink on this card itself, and Mire Trident, Timorous Calls the Dead, and something else that we're doing, I'll tell you about a little bit later, that we really don't mind taking a couple of damage, because there's so much incidental life gain in the deck, who cares? So don't really worry about that too much. What you really want out of this is a ridiculously good removal spell that's also a body on board. But at this point, you're probably asking yourself, why is this a Golgari deck? The title and thumbnail say that this deck is green-black, sir. Explain yourself? Well, it turns out Pelucranos is a zombie. Did you know that? That's right. He's a big old zombie Hydra good boy. Everybody loves Pelucranos. And in this deck, Pelucranos is kind of our version of Kroxa in the Rakdos decks right now. And even though you're not going to be playing this on turn 4, our early game is very similar to those Rakdos decks. We play Mire Triton and Timorite Calls the Dead to fill up our graveyard. And even though we're not going to be casting Pelucranos on 4, we still have plenty of time to get to it. Even though we don't have any ramp in this deck per se, we do have stuff like Valmire Knight and Mire Triton that have Death Touch to block in the early game. Plenty of removal to take care of problem creatures. And we've got, Mire Triton, Timorite Calls the Dead, and a couple of other cards that gain life to keep us in the game to the point where we can cast a Pelucranos out of the yard if we have to. Now, of course, you can naturally cast Pelucranos for 4 mana, and it's not bad. It turns out 4 mana 6/6s that can kill dudes ain't half bad. And in some cases, you'll destroy your own Pelucranos if it means you can take out an important creature on the other side of the board, because you can get your Pelucranos back, and they can't. That's what's going on in that last clip, but I got more clips of Pelucranos, because Pelucranos really shines when it can take out a whole board full of small creatures and still get in. In my experience, Pelucranos is well worth the green splash in the deck, not only because it's got the right creature type, but just because it's one of the best finishers available to us, and it usually comes out of the graveyard when we're at a point in the game where we're either in a war of attrition or one of us is out of resources. Our opponent is out of creatures, we're out of removal, but often we can just escape that Pelucranos, have the biggest creature in standard on the table, and if our opponent tries to play creatures against it, it ain't gonna work jack. It's just a really good card to make sure you can finish games off. But Pelucranos by itself just wasn't enough. It turns out we needed another finisher in this deck, and we've got a really good one available to us in Standard that I didn't play originally because I'd forgotten that Gary was a zombie. But it turns out it's got the right creature type for this deck, and it's an amazing finisher in a lot of late game situations. I was running into a lot of problems with this deck where I'd get the opponent to 4 or 5 life and not really be able to ram through that last bit of damage to finish the game off. And Gary solves that problem pretty elegantly. Like, check out this gameplay clip right here where we're able to get some damage in during the combat step against our opponent. We're actually even able to trick them into not blocking with Gilded Goose somehow. And then we finish them off with the Gary. I have no idea and we'll never understand why they didn't sacrifice this food token here, but they didn't, and I'll take the win. Now, besides Devotee, there actually is one more non-zombie creature in the deck, but it does lead to more zombies on down the line, and that's the silver bullet copy of Ephemia the Cacophony. At first, I started with 3 copies of this, but it actually doesn't make you as many zombies as you want, because the only actual enchantment in the deck is Timorite Calls the Dead. But it works so well with Timorite Calls the Dead that it's worth just playing 1 copy of this. I needed another 2-drop. I really wouldn't mind an evasive creature, so in the end, I decided 1 copy of Ephemia to push us up to 8 2-drops, which is still kind of low in the 2-drop department, was well worth it, because when this does give us an extra zombie off of a Timorite Calls the Dead, it's going to be really, really nice for your board state. And it happens more than you might think. Not only when Timorite Calls the Dead goes to the graveyard because it's done, you're done reading it, you've read all the chapters, but Timorite Calls the Dead itself will often put other Timorite Calls the Dead into the graveyard. Remember, too, by the way, that when you're escaping Pelucranos out of your yard or whatever, you often want to keep a copy or 2 of Timorite Calls the Dead in your yard so that you can actually make use of Ephemia if you draw it later in the game. Now, aside from that, we're playing some removal in this deck, as you may have guessed. We're playing 4 copies of Blood Chief's Thirst, as well as 2 Heartless Act and a single copy of Eliminate, which can take out some things that Heartless Act can't. So I'm going to play that. Like Scavenging Ooze is a card that we have a good amount of trouble against. I hate Ooze, and Heartless Act is terrible against it, so we'll play the Eliminate against not only Ooze, but plenty of other things that we might have trouble with. But Heartless Act is still a very good removal spell, and pretty much the most expensive uncommon removal spell in Standard right now. We'll play a couple of copies of that. And then Blood Chief's Thirst, which is just one of the most reliable removal spells in Standard, and also takes out Scavenging Oozes, I'll point out. But to finish off the main deck, I'm playing 3 copies of Agadeem's Awakening, and honestly, you could push it to 4 here, but I wanted to keep the deck a little under $100, and if we added 1 more copy, the deck would be like 102 or something like that. So I ended up not adding that fourth copy, but you could if you wanted to. And Agadeem's Awakening is actually one of the better cards in the deck. Again, you got to be careful with things like Timurid Calls the Dead and escaping your Pelucranos, because you want to make sure that Agadeem's Awakening is still a decent card when you draw it. So if you've got extra copies of, say, Mire Triton or any creature in your yard, get rid of those with Timurid Calls the Dead. Escape things like Bloodchief's Thirst and Heartless Act and Fabled Passage out of your graveyard when you're escaping Pelucranos. Remove those cards and try to keep your creatures intact, because not only do you have to have Timurid Calls the Dead, you have to have fuel for that, but you also have to have fuel for cards like Awakening, which can be amazing in the late game. Even a moderate Awakening like this one that you're seeing right now can just put you in an amazing board position when all seems lost. But there are incredible times where if you have the 8 mana that would normally be required to cast, say, an Ugin, you can just go ahead and win the game by getting a Gray Merchant and a bunch of other creatures out of your yard with an Awakening and just win the game on the spot. Now, here are your lands right here. Aside from Agadeem's Awakening, there are 23 lands in the deck, and there are minimal green sources because the only green card in the main deck, at least, is the Pelucranos. But there's going to be times where you need extra green sources because you want to fight more than one time in a turn, or late in the game you want to play a Pelucranos and fight with it on the same turn. So that's why we're playing a fair number of green sources. There's 2 forests to go grab with Fabled Passage if you need to. And Fabled Passage itself is a very important card because it helps you escape that Pelucranos later on in the game. Now here's your sideboard right here, and even though there is a single copy of Eliminate in there to go up against aggro decks and whatnot, most of our capital in the sideboard is spent trying to fight control decks, which can embarrass us, even though we have an escaped creature, even though we have Timurid Calls the Dead to get a lot of board presence, we have Agadeem's Awakening to get stuff out of our graveyard, we still have a good amount of trouble against decks that carry a butt ton of removal. So we need cards like Duress to get that removal and other big plays out of their hand. One of the cards we hate the most, for instance, is Elspeth Conquers Death against our Pelucranos. Duress can help take care of those things way before we ever have to worry about them. We've also got a couple of copies of Skyclave Shade in the deck. I'm only playing 2 of these in the board where I was originally on 4, but I think we only need a couple, especially with Mire Triton and Timurid Calls the Dead to help turn them over into our yard. I really don't think you need 4 copies of this card, but it's very good against control decks right now. Timurid Chosen from Death, not necessarily an anti-control card, but it is very good for making sure that you can snipe Croxes out of opposing graveyards. If your opponent is playing Elspeth Conquers Death, and this will make sure that it takes out any creature or planeswalker options that they might have in their yard. So a lot of good things Timurid does, plus this is effectively a Gary deck, so you can't go wrong with the turn 2 Timurid some of the time. We've also got a couple of copies of Return to Nature to take out artifacts and enchantments, very important card types in this format right now, and the ability to kill an Embercleave at instant speed is an important ability to have. Same thing with Great Hinge, and the list goes on and on. Felidar Retreat and whatnot. But this is also another way to snipe Croxes and important cards out of yards too. So if we're going to play one other green card in the entire deck, I think it should probably be Return to Nature. Aside from that, we do have another zombie in the board, and that's Liliana's Standard Bearer, which can help us out against Shatter the Sky and some other mass removal options, but not a whole lot. That said, even if your opponent's just using spot removal, Standard Bearer can feel pretty good some of the time because you'll get a 3/1 zombie and a drawn card, and they had to spend a card. You're coming out on top in that exchange, but I wish Standard Bearer was a little bit better, honestly. But against Shatter, it's an amazing card. Aside from that, the other 2 sideboard slots are taken up by Necromentia, a card I don't usually play, but in the current Standard, Necromentia can be really good against a couple of specific decks that are looking to get to Ugin and just win the game off the back of how powerful it is. Turns out if you take their Ugin out, they can't win some of the times. Just take that out, and they scoop at a surprising amount of the time. But there's also the cycling decks who can still win if you take their Zenith Flare, but it becomes much, much more difficult for them to actually finish games without it. So against cycling, take a Zenith Flare, you'll also get scoops from that. Now here are your power rankings for the deck. A final score of 66, which is actually pretty good for a deck that costs as little as this one does. Again, it's not a pure budget deck that's like 20, 30 bucks like we used to do a lot here on the channel, but it's still a deck that's going to cost you far less than a lot of other standard decks, and you can have a lot of fun with, and it's got a lot of dimensions too. I won't call it the most versatile deck in the world, but we do have a lot of resilience in this deck between Agadeem's Awakening and Liliana's Devotee. Cards like, Timorite Calls the Dead, Polukranos. We're doing a lot with our graveyard in this deck, and we're establishing a pretty big board state with cards like Ephemia and Timorite Calls the Dead. So as far as offense goes, we're not super explosive, but we do establish a respectable board state pretty early on in the game a lot of the time. If we can ride that and play a Liliana's Devotee to get some damage in, fine. But if we have to play through sweepers and spot removal, we can do that too with Polukranos and Agadeem's Awakening. At the same time, if we come up against decks that play creatures, we've got Murderous Rider, Bloodchief's Thirst, Heartless Act, Eliminate, and even Polukranos to take out creatures on the other side of the board. So even though the deck isn't super versatile and plays kind of linear in a lot of games, I will say that it does more than you might think it does on paper. So I'm not going to pretend this is the best deck in Standard or anything, but it does have a good amount of game against a surprising number of decks. It's fun to play, and if you like zombies, it's probably the deck for you in Standard right now. Plus, if you like decks like The Rock, try this thing out because we're effectively a green-black mid-range deck that plays good removal and recursive creatures. That sounds an awful lot like The Rock to me, and this deck works better than I thought it would when I first came up with the concept. So try it out if you possibly can, and if you do want this deck in paper, check out the first link in the description. Go over to TCG Player, get the deck for the cheapest prices on the internet. Aside from that, do all the YouTube stuff, like, subscribe if you haven't done those things yet. I know a lot of people that watch my videos aren't subscribed. Why? Just subscribe. Do it. And then you'll know when I put videos out instead of just having to be like, oh, let's see what Dev's doing. Oh, let's search his name. No, you just go to YouTube, and on the front page, there I'll be. In recommended sometimes. It's not a guarantee because YouTube's weird, but still. Subscribe, hit the bell for the notifications, do those things. You can also check out the Patreon, link in the description. It's just $1 a month to vote on what content we do here on the channel. That's why we got to do Golgari Zombies in the first place, is that a whole bunch of patrons voted on it, like a lot. This deck smashed the poll this time around, but if you want to participate in those polls, hit the link in the description, help support the channel. I would greatly appreciate that. Aside from that, you want to see me play some Magic with this and many other janky decks, just check out Twitch and go to twitch.tv/SBMTGDev or hit the link in the description. I would greatly appreciate your follow. It's completely free to follow on Twitch. Do it. We have a lot of fun on stream. But aside from that, I guess I'm done for this one. Just let me know how you felt about it and how you better or differently play the deck, you know? I was doing different stuff with this. Originally, I was playing Demonic Embrace. Ended up cutting that. So there were some other things I was doing with this deck. Let me know how you'd build it down there in the comments section, and I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.